Yep, I think it's time whenever you're ready.
Do you want us to be in this room or in a different breakout room?
I don't think there is a breakout room. This is the audience because there are two sessions, one after the other.
Okay, awesome, cool. Then
yes.
I will share my screen, and Judi is with me as well. Judi is my co-presenter because we're going to be presenting on a paper that we wrote, and initially that paper. Wait, you should be. Can you see my screen and
yes,
the title of the slides? Awesome. Initially, this paper was my bachelor thesis, and Judi was my supervisor, and then she became my co-author, and now she's my co-presenter. But I will be doing most of the talking, and she will add wherever that's needed. Before we start, I want to say I'm very excited. Very fun to be able to talk about this for 30 minutes with all of you listening. So that's very nice. And if you have any questions, make sure to ask them throughout the presentation, especially if it's a clarifying question. If you're losing track of where I'm going, just unmute yourself and ask the question. So to get a bit of an idea of the audience, are there people in here who have worked with video observation in research or in practice? Cool. And has anyone ever felt that video observing your participants might also change the behavior of your participants, that you see that they're a bit, right? And anyone who has ever been videotaped has noticed this, right? That you feel you're aware of the camera. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So the outline of the presentation is that we will start with a paper, this paper that was published today, exactly 3 weeks ago. And in this paper, we find some evidence that observing infants and parents might influence the behavior of the parents. But mostly we're discussing the paper because I think it might be an interesting case study in thinking about camera reactivity, the different concepts, different ways of measuring it, right? Different ways of analyzing it. And hopefully that helps you in your own research when you are working with video cameras. Then in the second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about what to do about camera reactivity. How do you deal with it if you are working with video observation? But most of it will be on the paper. And the paper is situated in developmental psychology, right? So it's about infants and parents, but the conclusions and all the lessons should extrapolate to all realms of psychology. So it should be relevant to everyone in here. Now, I learned when I wanted to do my thesis with Judi that a lot is being done with video observation, and that's super useful, right? You have a parent and you have a child and they're playing together and you videotape them and you score their behavior and then you correlate that with developmental outcomes later in life. But I also found out that almost no one has asked the question of whether the videotaping itself doesn't change the behavior that we're measuring. And that would be a big problem, right? If our measurement devices change what we're measuring. And it turned out that Judi had an enormous database of infants playing with their parents. So I was going to video code all of them for behaviors of that signal that people are aware of the camera, right? So looking at the camera or talking about the camera. And this was during COVID. So I had all the time in the world to watch hours and hours of these videos. This was my home station at the time. And as you can see, every time I was watching, I had ideas if I need to put this in the discussion, and then I would put it on a post-it and put it on the wall. So this was my life for half a year. It was very fun. Right. So what were the goals of this study? The first goal really was to simply get a descriptive understanding of camera-related behaviors, right? Do infants look at the camera at all? How long do they look at it? Does it decrease over time? Are there certain parent characteristics that predict whether parents look at it or talk about the camera? Right? Because really, we knew very little about it. So the first thing we want to know is, what does it look like? But of course, the descriptives is not the most, doesn't answer our question. So what we did, we wanted to correlate camera-related behaviors with a certain variable of interest. And it happened to be that such a variable of interest had already been coded in this database, and that was parental sensitivity. Now, parental sensitivity, roughly speaking, refers to the ability to judge the signals of your child and respond appropriately, right? So if your child is crawling towards you, then if you're at your phone and you have no idea that they want your attention, that's not very sensitive. And similarly, if your child crawls away and wants to play by itself, but you're intrusively saying, "Oh no, look at daddy," that's also not very sensitive, right? So the much more sensitive approach is to judge their signals and respond appropriately. And we could correlate these two, right? And if there's a correlation, then that might signal some camera reactivity. But of course, a correlation, right, we can do more. Because if there's a correlation, right, doesn't prove causation yet, but there could be different causal models to explain such a correlation. So what we do in the paper is that we set up two different causal models, and they lead to different hypotheses that we can then test with our observational data. So the first causal model is this one. So here it starts with the camera-related behaviors of the infant, right? So the infant is looking at the camera, and that makes the parent aware of the camera. Now what you notice is there's a difference between camera awareness and camera-related behaviors, whereas awareness refers very much, right, to the internal process, the feeling of being observed, whereas the behaviors are the things that we can see on the outside. And then because the parent is aware of the camera, firstly, they also display camera-related behaviors. They start to look at the camera, they start to talk about the camera, but also they become less sensitive, right? This was our theoretical model. And the reason that they would become less sensitive, you can imagine if you're very distracted by the idea of the camera, then you might have less attention for your child, right? So it might interfere with your ability to parent. We explain more ideas and reasons in the paper, but this is just the general idea. So this is one of the first causal models that can explain such a correlation. Another model is the following, where you actually start with the camera awareness of the parent. So the parent is feeling very much observed. Again, because of that, we get camera-related behaviors by the parent. The parent looks at the camera, the parent becomes less sensitive. But in this case, because the parent is less sensitive, the infant starts to display camera-related behaviors, which you can also imagine, right? If you're an infant and your parent is not really attentive and sensitive to you, then you might turn your attention elsewhere and then you become interested in the camera. So both of these models generate the following three hypotheses, and they have those in common, right? So the same hypotheses for both. The first one is that you would expect parents' camera-related behavior, CRB, to be negatively correlated with parental sensitivity. So parents that look a lot at the camera are less sensitive. The second one is that you expect infants' camera-related behaviors to also be negatively related to parental sensitivity, right? So infants that look a lot at the camera have parents that are not too sensitive. And the third one is that infants' camera-related behaviors and parents' camera-related behaviors are positively related, right? So infants that look a lot at the camera also have parents that look a lot at the camera. So these hypotheses they have in common, but there's one difference. But then if you go back here, the camera-related behaviors of the parent precede the camera-related behaviors of the infant. So first the parent looks and then the infant looks. But in this one, first the infant looks and then the parent looks. So they're distinguished by the sequencing. And what was very nice was that we microcoded all of the behaviors. So that meant that, right, we could say all the onset times and offset times of all of the times the parent or infant looked at the camera, we coded. So for example, we could see that at minute 102 until minute 105, the infant looked at the camera. And then starting minute 106, the parent would look at the camera. So there you can really elegantly see the sequencing of the behavior. Who looks first, the parent or the infant? And that sequencing differentiates those two models. So the third goal of the study was to look at the sequencing of the camera-related behaviors of the parents and the infants. So that was what we were going to try to test with our study. It's so far clear. Are there any questions about what we were trying to do? Anything to add from Judi? Cool. Then on the methods, fairly briefly, we had an N of 75. So there were 75 couples, a parent and a father and a mother, and they played independently with their infant, right? So for every couple, we had 2 videos, one with the father and the infant, one with the mother and the infant. The videos lasted for 5 minutes, right? And they were playing as usual. So just parent and the infant, usually on their lap, playing together, 5-minute video observation. Camera-related behaviors we operationalized as follows. So we had looking at the camera, we had talking about the camera for parents, not for infants, gesturing towards the camera and other. The first 2 were by far the majority of cases. So most of the behaviors were looking at or talking about the camera. So that's very briefly the methods. Of course, much more explanation in the paper, but for now, that's all that you need to know. So what did we find? So aim number 1, getting a descriptive understanding of camera-related behaviors. And here I have some nice graphs for you. So this is a bar chart of the percentage of total interaction time that infants, fathers, and mothers displayed camera-related behaviors. And the first thing that you really see is that the blue bars are a lot bigger than the orange and the green bars. And as you can see, infants looked at the camera a lot more than their parents, a lot more, right? For infants, this is average, by the way. So for infants, it's between 10 and 14%. For fathers and mothers, it's like 0.2, 0.5. So parents barely look at the camera. And actually, most parents display no camera-related behaviors at all, right? So very, very stark contrast. Infants display a lot of camera-related behaviors, parents barely any. And the same holds if you don't look at average, but at maximum times, right? So here you can see there was 1 infant that looked at the camera for more than half of total interaction time when they were playing with a mother, 1 that looked at the camera for more than 1/3 of total interaction time, but also their parents really were pretending that the camera didn't exist, weren't engaging with it, weren't looking at it, weren't talking about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing we want to know is whether this behavior decreases over time. Because if we see that after the 5 minutes, there's no behaviors at all anymore, that might be an indication that a lead-in period of 5 minutes would work really well, right? To let the parent and the infant get adjusted to the camera. So that's what we looked at. Another beautiful graph. And what you can see here, right? This is for infants playing with their father, infants looking at the camera. The behavior does decrease over time, and there's a moderate correlation, but you can also quite clearly see that it hasn't disappeared after the full 5 minutes. And you see a similar pattern when they're playing with their mothers, right? So the decrease over time is a bit less strong, the correlation coefficient is a bit lower, but the general pattern, it decreases but doesn't disappear. Is it clear how people should read these graphs, or some explanation needed? Awesome. Now, how does that look like for parents' camera-related behaviors, right? Because these were infants' camera-related behaviors. Similar patterns, except for father looking. For all of them, we also saw a decrease over time, but also for all of them, very clear, it hadn't disappeared after the full 5 minutes. And what you can also see in this is that there was a lot less CRB of parents because the bars of the bar chart of the histogram are much thicker than in the previous one. So we see a similar pattern for parents' camera-related behaviors. This one also clear? How to read this? Awesome. And then lastly, on describing camera-related behaviors, are there certain predictors of whether parents look at or talk about the camera? There were none. None of the parent characteristics predicted whether they looked at or talked about the camera. It has to be said here that for these analyses, we dichotomized parents' camera-related behaviors because there were so many parents that didn't look at the camera at all. We said either you look at the camera or talk about the camera, or you don't. So a 0 or a 1. But of course, that's a bit of a crude measure. So maybe this null finding could be explained by that crude measure. But that's our loss, so to say. So aim number 1, that was. Aim number 2, the relation between camera-related behaviors and parental sensitivity. Right, and here again, we're going to look at the camera-related behaviors of infants and of parents. Now, parents' camera-related behaviors did not predict their own sensitivity. So whether a parent looked at or talked about the camera was not related to their parental sensitivity score. Again, this null finding might be explained by the crude measure of CRB for parents, might be explained by limited power because so many parents didn't look at it, but here's a null finding. So hypothesis number one for both of the causal models, we don't find evidence for that parents' camera-related behaviors and parental sensitivity are negatively interrelated. That was the hypothesis. We don't find the evidence. But this is the graph for infants' camera-related behaviors. So infants looking at the camera on the x-axis and parental sensitivity score on the y-axis. This is exclusive material. You don't get this graph in the paper, but I think it's very telling. So that's why I'm including it. So what can you already see? You see that probably there is a negative relation, right? Indeed, our regression models find that if you do this, there's a negative correlation between infant looking at the camera and parental sensitivity. But you also see that it's probably driven by all of the observations on the right bottom side of the graph, where infants looked at the camera for more than 100 seconds. And that was true. If you exclude those, the relationship disappears. But these were not bivariate outliers. We had already Winsorized them. So these were just, sort of, they weren't outliers. And another thing you can notice is that especially for fathers, if it's based on those two observations around the line of 100 seconds infant looking at the camera, it's not extremely robust. But what we did, because it was an exploratory study, we very inductively had a model in which we coded infant looking at the camera as a binary. So either they looked at the camera for more than 100 seconds, or they didn't look at it for more than 100 seconds, use that as a predictor of parental sensitivity. Now, obviously, that's going to be highly significant if you just look at this graph. And indeed, it is highly significant, right? So the predicted sensitivity scores of fathers was 3.5 points lower if their infant looked at the camera for more than 100 seconds. Now, if you look at this graph, 3.5 points is a lot, right? This is a scale from 1 to 9, realistically from 3 to 8. That's a huge effect size. A very significant, similar finding for mothers, right? 2.3 scores lower if their infant looked at the camera for more than 100 seconds. So there seems to be a sort of threshold model here, where in the beginning, if your infant looks a bit more, there's not a very strong correlation with your parental sensitivity. But if your infant looks a lot at the camera for more than 1/3 of interaction time, then you seem to be having a bit of a problem, or at least you seem to be having a lot lower sensitivity scores. So that's what we find here, right? So what do we learn from this on hypothesis 2, that infants' camera-related behaviors and parental sensitivity are negatively interrelated? For mothers, yeah, we're confident in saying that this hypothesis is supported. For fathers, if we choose the model inductively, we find it, but it's based on only 2 cases. So we definitely need some replication for this effect for fathers, a bit less robust there. So that is on aim number 2. Is that clear? Are there any questions about this section? Cool. Then we go to aim number 3. Aim number 3, the sequencing of parents and infants. Now, we used time series models here, right? Because we had all the microcoded data. They were multi-level models. I won't delve into the depths of that. You can read the paper if you're interested. What are the findings in this aim? We find that infants looking at the camera very clearly predicted the mother looking at or talking about the camera. So if an infant looked at the camera, 1 or 2 seconds later, the mother was about 5 times as likely to also look at the camera. What was interesting for infants and fathers was that they predicted each other. So a father was a lot less likely to look at or talk about the camera if their infant had looked at the camera 1 second before that moment. But the same applied to infants. So the sequencing for infants and fathers was running in both directions. What does this tell us? Firstly, hypothesis 3 is supported, right? That infants' camera-related behaviors and parents' camera-related behaviors are positively related because they predict each other over time. But also, and now the interesting part comes, we can differentiate a bit between the 2 causal models that we set up in the theoretical introduction. And it seems that for mothers, this model is favored, right? Because we saw that first the infant looked and then the mother looked. So first we have the camera-related behaviors of the infant. The infant looks, the mother becomes aware of the camera, then the mother also looks. And we have also found evidence for that upward arrow because infant looking and parental sensitivity were negatively related. So the parent becomes aware of the camera and then becomes a bit less sensitive. Now, of course, we cannot prove this causal model, right? It's just an observational study, but it does generate hypotheses and we can test those. So our observations are most consistent with this model. Yeah, so that's what we found in the paper. And that's, yeah, any questions about that or any comments, any thoughts? Otherwise, we'll go to the second part about what to do about camera reactivity.
If no one is saying, I was quite amazed with the study because not only I see it's about how artificial conditions in the lab situation can influence behavior, but it also made me realize the first thing that came to my mind was all the attachment theories and how children were studied in either restraint situation or other behavioral observations. And I see how that could have been, cameras, reactivity could have been one part of it. But what interestingly you also did was, in this study, you studied both the grown-up people's behavior. Yeah, so that's triple threat right there. That's a wonderful job done, because you didn't only study how babies would behave under camera reactivity or sensitive situation. You also tried to study how adults would behave. I had one interesting question, which from the beginning just bothered me, was that how do you think that the size of the camera and the placement of the camera and the awareness of the camera played a role?
So our study has no evidence for that because we have no variation in there. Personally, yes, I think so. If you have like an enormous film crew, of course, people feel more aware than if you have a tiny hidden camera. So actually, that's one of the things I would try to minimize the presence of the camera. And one thing as well is that in our study, researchers were positioned behind the camera because they had to move around, because sometimes parents and infants would move around. But of course, that must have increased the observational reactivity. So ideally, you would have the researcher out of the room. Yeah, so I think so for sure. And Judi, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'd like to add that this study was actually done at home. So these are not lab observations, but home observations. And generally in lab observations with the strange situation procedure, cameras tend to be a bit more hidden in the corners of a lab, right? So the parent might know where they are, but the infant does not tend to know where they are. So I think that's also a difference. So this was researchers going to a person's home, setting up a camera, right, on a tripod. So for sure, with home observations, a camera is much more visible than they would be in the lab, actually.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. And quickly, I would want to something that, another point that quite intrigued me was that I want to know, in this observation of how infant notice the camera most of the times, were they also the first one to notice the camera and look at it as compared to the parents?
Yeah, by far, most of the cases, the first ones. But of course, that's also due to you could say that's due to a base rate issue. Because if an infant looks at the camera 60 times as often as a parent, then they're also more likely to look at it first. That's why we had the time series analyses. So they also actually disproportionately often looked at it before their parents.
And of course, parents were told to ignore the camera, but infants don't, understand that type of instruction. So I think parents were probably trying not to look at it, whereas the infants, of course, do whatever infants do.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I actually think that might have, we'll get to you in a bit, Ekaterina, but that might have very much influenced the relationship with parental sensitivity. Because if your infant is looking at the camera and you're told that you're supposed to pretend that the camera isn't there, then you're going to be like, oh God, no, don't look at the camera. Look at me, look at daddy, look at daddy. Then you become insensitive. Whereas if you would have felt that it's fine to observe with or interact with the camera, it would have been a lot easier for parents to say, oh, look at the camera. Isn't it interesting to be observed? And actually have a very sensitive response. So,
Yeah.
and I think this might generalize to other settings, but I'm curious about your guys' thoughts. By and large, maybe it's a good idea to tell participants that it's okay that the camera is there, because then they don't have to inhibit their behavior and their awareness of it too much. So that's also one idea. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joop and Judi. Yes, Katrina. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the questions. Katarina, what did you want to ask?
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask to somehow, I don't understand the last point. So for parents not attending to their children's behavior when they're looking into the camera, why is it termed as insensitivity? Can it be that exactly because the parents were told not to look into the camera, cam, that they were trying to somehow force their baby not to look and to apply with these rules? And that's why I don't know. I still think that the parents react, they just react differently. It doesn't mean that they ignore their baby. They maybe try to do what the researchers told them. So how you can be sure what's happening there? Thank you.
No, I think you're completely right. But also if you are forcing the baby to focus on you instead of the camera in which the baby is sort of intrinsically interested, that's also an insensitive response. Because you have a signal of the child that is the child is interested in the camera, and instead of following the child, you force it back to you. So I think that could very much explain this negative correlation. Yeah.
And that can be done both sensitively and insensitively, right? Redirecting an infant's attention can be done sensitively and insensitively. And of course, once you feel like you have to do that, a portion of the parents is going to do that insensitively. And I think that's some of the effects that we looked at.
Understand. Thank you.
Cool. No, but very good comment. I fully agree. Yeah. Marjolein, what do you want to ask or say?
Ja, bijna hetzelfde. Joep, wil jij het vertalen? Het feit dat een kind kijkt en die moeder dan ook kijkt, kan toch juist sensitivity zijn? Dat ze het dus juist spiegelt en herhaalt en nog, het kan toch ook juist positief zijn? En dat daarom die vaders dat wat minder doen? Haha.
Yeah, so to translate,
Yes, please.
it could be, if an infant would look at the camera and then the mother would mirror that, or their father, and they would also look at the camera, and together they look at the camera, there's, oh, isn't the camera interesting? That would be joint attention, and that would be a very sensitive response. That's completely correct. But the problem is that parents are told that they shouldn't look at the camera. So you are inhibiting that joint attention, and therefore you don't get that response that could be very sensitive. Yeah.
And some parents do it, right? We have seen parents who do just simply follow the infant's attention and say, oh, isn't that interesting? And then slowly move back into another type of game. But some quite rigidly want to follow the rules and then, potentially become less sensitive.
And I mean, this is very qualitative, right? But you really see this in some parents, that you can see them be so aware, but very rigidly not be looking at the camera, and then sort of poking at the child to look at them. So you really see the model happening there. Yeah, so we already went a bit into what to do about camera reactivity. I think there's two categories of strategies. The first one, which I think is really important, which is not done enough, is measure it. I really cannot stress that enough. Maybe should have added more exclamation marks, but measure it, because then you can correlate it with your important variables in your study. And if you don't find a correlation, that's quite convincing evidence that actually it was no problem and that it didn't hamper with the validity of your study. So I think ideally you would also microcode the behaviors, right? Every time that they look at the camera, they talk about the camera, you microcode it, but that's quite time intensive. So if you don't have the time for that, it's still better to macro code it, which would be you look at the full 5 minutes, and then you assign a general score of between 0 and 7 or whatever. And then still you can see if there's variation between parents with a high score and a low score on the variables that you're that you're including in your study. So those are the sort of observational approaches of measuring. But one also very interesting one, if you look at the model again, you see that the mediator here is camera awareness of the parent, which is an internal process, remember? And you can also try to assess that internal process directly using qualitative measures. So you can ask surveys, how aware were you of the parent? Do you of the camera? Do you feel that the camera influenced your behavior? You can try to interview participants. And what you actually find in the very little literature that's about on it, and also in medicine, there's a little more literature, is that these qualitative studies using qualitative measures find much more evidence for camera reactivity than studies using objective measures, which is very logical if participants are trying to inhibit their camera-related behaviors. You don't see them looking at the camera, but internally they're going, oh God, I'm being observed, oh God. Right, so actually trying to tap into that directly using qualitative measures, I think, would be very valuable. And you can still do the same, right? If you have a 7-point Likert scale, you can still correlate it with the variables in your study and see if there's an issue there. So that's strategy number one. Strategy number two is try to minimize camera reactivity. And we already discussed a few strategies here. So indeed, tries to place the camera out of sight. I've seen some studies that use, in the home observation setting, an iPad, because it's much smaller and they can hide it behind a book mostly. Whereas if you have a camera on a tripod, it's more like, boom, it's in the room. So you can try to hide the camera. You can try to make sure that the researcher is out of the room. I think it would also be useful to have a certain lead-in period. Right? So firstly, let the participants get used to the camera, already observe them for 5 or 10 or 20 minutes. And after that, only start doing your real observation. But then they've already become habituated to the camera and probably have a bit less camera reactivity. I have no clue how long that lead-in period should be. There's just not enough literature to give a clear answer. Some use 5 minutes, others use 20 minutes. Maybe it should be much more. But more research could be done here to see after what period it really sort of stabilizes at a rate of camera-related behaviors. So that would be interesting as well. And what we discussed, I think it can be very valuable to tell participants that it's okay if they are interested in the camera, and it's okay that the camera exists. And maybe telling them to pretend that the camera doesn't exist only creates all of this inhibition and awareness and interferes with the results. So those are some strategies that we propose in the paper, but maybe people in here have other ideas and other suggestions that we can all learn from. And if not, then this is what you can do with it. Take it into account, measure it, minimize it, and then you can reap all the benefits of video observation. So yeah, that was our talk on the paper.
Thank you, and Judi, for being present here. I think we are right on time, actually. So we can open the house for discussion. If you have any questions, queries, we
maybe unshare, Job, so we can go back to seeing each other.
That's a very good idea. Yeah.
Yes, Yanchen is congratulated. Thank you. And I was curious how beneficial it would be, especially in qualitative research and data analysis, because if camera sensitivity is much more studied, I think it would be very beneficial because a lot of triangulation can help in reducing the error if you have captured all of these phenomena before you're planning an observation study, especially while using cameras. So a lot of error variance in qual research can, I think, be reduced because of this, or quantitative research as well. Yes.
No, I fully agree. But I think if it is true that in this case, for example, the infant looking at the camera causes certain insensitivity, and infants looking at the camera is just randomly distributed throughout the population, then right now we are seeing a lot of variations in parental sensitivity that are only due because some infants like looking at the camera. And if we could control for that, then you would indeed reduce that error variance. So I think it would be awesome to measure much more of this. Yeah.
Great, great. All right, if we don't have any other questions or queries, then Job and Judi, would you mind, because we didn't introduce the presenters in the beginning, would you mind introducing yourself now for a bit?
I mean, I'm Job. I'm currently doing a master's in clinical psychology. And I did my bachelor's in liberal arts and sciences, where I wrote this thesis paper with Judi. Yeah.
I'm Judi Mesman. I'm a professor of the interdisciplinary study of societal challenges. That's my official title, but I focus mostly on issues of diversity in parenting and child development at Leiden University in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Job and Judi, and really nice meeting you. Yeah, thank you so much. Really wonderful presentation and work.
Thank you very much for the platform. It was very fun.
Yeah. All right, I think we do have our next presenters here with us, Yanchen and Annick. Yes, please, the stage is yours. Would you like to introduce yourself first and then start, or either ways is good with us?
All right, thank you so much, Neha, and thanks for the fabulous presentation. And Job, right? Did I pronounce your name right? So I'll try my best to. Oh, it's hard to beat, but we'll try our best. So, all right, Annick, should we take turns to introduce ourselves, or I think I may share my screen first because I have the slides with me, and our first slide's got our names. So as you can see, we are a multinational team. So. My name is Yanchen Zhang, and I'm an assistant professor of Psych and Quantitative Foundations at the University of Iowa. And my colleagues and co-authors, Annick, could you please introduce our team?
Hello, I'm Annick Janson. I'm a clinical psychologist and did my PhD in developing leadership through online media. So I use it in the disability sector. We work with families, and I like Judi's title with working with diversity with parents. So that's what we do too.
Yes, thank you so much, Annick. And also, due to the time difference, our team is all across the globe. So it's for some of them, it's like 3 or 2 a.m. in the morning. It's hard for them to join. But I want to introduce our other team members. Sylvana is a CEO and also a key contributor to the Parliamentary Child Service, the nonprofit for parents raising children with disabilities. And Mogi is our wonderful research coordinator. And Maggie Kern she is a prolific and wonderful researcher for positive psychology from University of Melbourne. And Annick, should we start with the first slide? All right.
Yes.
It's all yours.
So we would like to talk to you about a program called Now and Next. It's a strength-based intervention. It's a parenting program informed by systems-informed positive psychology. It was co-designed by professionals and families. So it's a 20-hour program for parents of children with disability that can be facilitated over 8 short sessions or 4 longer sessions. It has got a manualized curriculum. It includes evidence-based positive psychology interventions such as character strength, mindfulness, well-being. It actually starts with a positive psychology intervention that is called prospection, so to help parents set inspiring goals. The program empowers parents to formulate and achieve goals for their child, their family, and for themselves. These are parents who have children with disability, as mentioned before. And parents are connected into different channels so that they form small communities of practice with which they learn. And then furthermore, the peer parents are then trained to run the program, those who want to and can. The co-founders of this program, and one of them says, this is the program we needed when our children were little. Since we launched the program, we've been incorporating parents' ideas through active ongoing co-design. So we launched the program in 2015, as you can see on this timeline. It started as a conventional program in the individual interventions led by professionals in a one-on-one relationship with parents about their young child. And a year later, we then piloted a group program, still led by professionals, as we thought that parents learning together would provide additional supports to each other. During this pilot, it's the participating parents who suggested that the program should be facilitated by parents who had graduated. So this started us on a path of peer support to contribute to parents learning together. This has been the format of the program since 2017. We train parents to become peer workers, and we launched 3 international hubs later on. 2 years before COVID started, we actually launched online program via Zoom because we wanted to reach out to geographically isolated families. When comparing online and face-to-face outcome, our initial results were promising. So when COVID-19 erupted, we just turned on the switch to all our programs being facilitated via Zoom. And then finally on the timeline, you can see we added an online training for our peer workers as well as some of our tools so that everything now can be done via Zoom. And we also have a bespoke creative visioning and goal setting tool that we can train both parents and professionals via Zoom as well. So this slide is our theory of change, and it explains how parents get empowered through peer support. It describes the high-level graphic, the evidence base that we start from on the bottom level, where we focus our actions in the system, and that the impact that we're wanting to achieve is shown on the top band to build family capacity through participation. Just to put this in context, family participation is very important, but it can't be taken for granted because many people take their child to what they feel is an expert and expect the expert to act. And we really want to foster the parents to be actively involved. That's our aim. So this theory of change is linked to a website that explains all these parts individually. You can see the link on top, but it'll also be on the last slide. Within a system-informed positive psychology perspective, we're working with 3 elements of the system. On the left column, we have historically the disability sector assigned the responsibility on professionals to create effective partnerships with families. But as family center practice developed, the focus became increasingly on the family's role as the right. However, what we're finding in our research in developing these peer workers as a workforce is in the center part. Then the role of the emerging family leaders is revealed as an increasingly important link between professionals and families. And perhaps we can talk here about a leverage point in the system. So we achieve outcomes by running evidence-based programs, the Now and Next, to increase families' empowerment, hope, agency, and well-being. And during the program, parents and carers learn with their peer groups to formulate and achieve inspiring goals for their children, build novel partnership with professionals that are strong and positive, and optimize their informal networks. In terms of sustaining outcome, these 3 groups of people converge as a community of practice level, and how learning continues for each group. So we talk about systems-informed positive psychology. It's just a very short description here, and it explicitly incorporates aspects of system science into positive psychology so that we can theorize and explain better our results. So the next slide is an illustration that summarizes a case study showing how we use the system-informed positive psychology perspective lens to analyze the experience of parents of young children with families. We critically examine typical approaches to disability support for families of young children. The data helped us identify the existence of 2 dominant paradigms. Disability is a disadvantage, and experts know best. We can see those on the left side of the illustration. Thematic analysis, focus group data identified 2 primary themes representing alternative perspectives that arose through the intervention. These are on the right side of the illustration. We will start with our strength, and we've got this. Participants indicated that they developed a great sense of well-being and concepts practicing in their routines and their communication with children. Example of these comments are under the seesaw. This is a very brief outlook. So the case study provided clear examples of how the shift in perspective can occur. It showed that system-informed positive psychology principles within early intervention approach provides a potential pathway for shifting the problematic paradigms that dominate disability care. And we demonstrate how this system shifts through a downward pressure, as illustrated on the right.
All right, Annick, do you mind me? Probably I can take over from here.
Yes,
yeah, definitely.
Over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Annick, because our team is a hybrid team, and we both, all of us contribute our own share of expertise to this project. That's the beauty and why I love this team and this project. So Annick, as a co-developer of the whole program, she did her kind of all efforts and clinical experience in excuse me, my third is not working in my favor today, all into this program. So I think it would be best for Annick to lead us through the nuts and bolts as well as the history of evolution for this wonderful program. For me, I'm the research, excuse me again, I'm the research nerd and stats nerd on this team. So that's why I will take on from the research question to methodology and result section for our presentation. So basically, whichever research we want to develop it through a ABT framework. So A is what we know and what we know. B stands for but what we don't know, what there is a problem. Therefore, we are going to do this research. So as we all know, our team is consisted of school, child, and clinical psychologists, all applied researchers. We all experience the excruciating long-standing paradigm in the field that basically focus on the deficit of kiddos. So what's wrong with your kid? And then expert experience or expertise. And for us, we want to flip the playground to empower the parents to, as the paradigm in training schools, training psychologists goes in the modern society, train the trainers. And also we want to focus on the positive psychological outcomes that belies the narrative we gleaned through the qualitative side of this non-next program. And that will bring us to this preliminary pilot trial, which we answer multiple research questions, but there are 2 that's most important. First of all, is the effectiveness of the non-next program on the well-being or other positive psychological outcomes of parents raising children with disabilities. And then we want to dive deeper to look into the cross-level working mechanism of change, or in other words, the moderating effect of those group characteristics, like as Annick mentioned, whether it's delivered face-to-face or online, whether it's free or for a small charge of fee. And now let's get into the nerdy part of this study, all the numbers. I know everyone is longing to the closing session or social hours, so I will try my best to make this part fun and hopefully informative for you. And for those who are in your evening time, I will try my best to keep you awake. So the first thing is our sample. The setting point of our study is a massively diverse international sample. We have 85 cohorts that's across all over the globe, and that consists the final sample after we're teasing out miscellaneous or other attrition. We end up with 561 parents raising children with disabilities. And as you can see, the old cliche story about parenting program is that it's always mothers come to those programs. But to our delight, we got quite a fair share of mothers. And we have a large portion of non-English speakers. That's probably because we have an international sample. So now let's try to see a fancy visualization to about where our parents come from. Can you see this slide? Can you see this map? Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we basically got countries from all over the globe, well, except for Antarctica or the Greenland. And we got multiple countries, and we basically have a fair share of all the 5 continents: African, Asian, Europe, Oceania, and North and South America. So what do we do to measure the outcome we care about, which is our dependent variable or DVs? We focus on the parent-reported well-being related outcomes that's assessed at pre and intermediate and post-program completion. There are 3 major scales we use that contains a lot of sub-scales. One is PERMA, which is multidimensional measure of well-being. The other is adult hope scale. And the last but not least is psychological empowerment scale, because that's what we care. We want to empower them. And we fit fancy little 3-level multi-level models for each outcome. By each DV, I mean each subscale or total or the total score of those 3 scales. I know the equation here almost look like gibberish for those who do not do stats often. So here is a user-friendly translation. So basically 3 levels. We have cohort or group at the 3rd level. 2nd level is individual. Within individual, the pre, intermediate, and post measure is nested within each individual. And what do we find? Well, through my years of experience in academia and as well as a reviewer, I know that concise is always a key to success or successfully grab our audience attention. So we summarize our results, primary results, in 1 sentence. The non-annex peer support groups based on the positive psychological principle or strategies indeed can empower to a certain extent the parents raising children with disabilities. While there is always a but. Group characteristics did moderate their effectiveness. So individual, their responsiveness to this program will vary depending on the delivery format or other group characteristics. So that's where our covariates or moderates come into play. We have 6 key moderators. One is whether it's Zoom or in person, and 4-week, a short version, or full-length 8-week version, whether it's delivered in English or community-based language, whether it's free or you have to pay a certain fee. And then it's similar to teacher-student ratio, we have facilitator to participants ratio. And last is sum of all the facilitators' experience in certain group. And as you can see on the right, here is the key coefficient on the 3rd level, the group level, their multi-level regression coefficient, which is basically you can treat them as effect size. As you can see, something interesting come into play, and we will explain we summarize it here. First of all, we know in general, the non-NEXT program actually have positive effect across all the 3 key outcomes, including their subscales. Also, individuals, they will respond differently based on the method of implementation. That is, first of all, the briefer version, which is 4-week version, maybe more, the effect size is larger than the full version, especially during the time pressure, during the recent years where COVID disrupt our life, and the family who with children with disabilities, they will more appreciate the time efficient ones. And then we found out that although not better, but online group where Zoom functions comparatively to the in-person face-to-face delivery. So that really sheds light in future practice of parenting program where we can, if for those parents who are from international or from a remote area and cannot afford the transportation to the delivery, to the implementation hub or like our organizations, we can totally do it online to achieve at least comparable effectiveness. And now after the quantitative section of this study, we did a qualitative focus group or other studies, and we summarized the active ingredients of the AN program. Basically is what make it different from other program and what make it effective. Annick, do you want to take on?
Yes, so this was the results of an excellent report done by Dr. Tim Moore and his team from the Murdoch Children's Hospital. And his conclusion was that there's quite a list of potential active ingredients, which he suggests that we follow on and work on and see which ones perhaps have different effects. So is it that parent-to-parent contact? Is it the fact that the structure, the sequences of structure is very structured? There's a curriculum, so it's not too much left to hazard. Is it the fact that the parents are facilitators themselves, so people identify more with them than they might with a professional? The positive psychology framework, we think it's important. Focusing on parents' long-term hopes as well as short-term goals. That's what parents mention a lot. Now, also, when we talk about short-term goals, we actually make sure that these are achievable. So we work on them to formulate goals that they could achieve very soon throughout the program, because that sustains them to carry on in the program and to carry on to it's sort of an addiction. They become very wanting to achieve more and more goals if they start well. So we are putting a focus on this. It's also, maybe is it because that it's not just a focus on the child, as is often the case in families with young children, but very well on the family and the parents as well. So we would have discussions with parents about their own personal goals. Like some people have unspoken goals, go back to work, go back to study, because they often stay at home with a child with disability. We have, as mentioned before, specially designed tools. So Pictability is one. If you are going to check our links, you can see how we use this very, very creative way to set goals. We also encourage people to think about outcomes rather than therapies, because when sometimes we ask parents, what would you like? What are your goals for this year? Oh, I want more therapy for my children, but therapy is actually a means to an end. It can't be a goal in itself. And throughout the program, people understand that, as well as understanding how important their role is. And solving goals through your own actions, real-time data feedback, whereas as you could see from Yanchen analysis, we have truckload of data, because everything, all the data occurs in real time, and it gets put into databases as we progress. So we have a huge amount of data. So yeah. The feedback from parents, it emphasizes that it was important for them to pay attention to themselves also, that they feel empowered, that they very much connect to the fact that the program is strength-based as opposed to what Yanchen mentioned before, deficit-based, because very often when you get to a therapy room, the first thing is, well, what's not working with the child? And that's very disempowering. So the strength-based approach is, let's focus on what's working now and make it stronger, make it bigger. So yeah, it's been beneficial, as people say, not just in their comments, but with the data that Yanchen presented. Yep. So we've got some more information from you if you want, and hand out. Do you want to speak to the 3-item survey, Yanchen, because we're actively looking for team members around the world. So if people are interested in joining the network, go ahead, Yanchen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Annick. And I know we're short on time. So basically it's And I do not want to turn this into a big advertisement of commercial for us, but we are a group of researchers and non-profits. So if you're interested in co-authoring and collaborating with us, feel free to reach out by filling out this 3-item survey, and we will reach out with free resources, and maybe in future we can collaborate on multinational randomized trial for publishing together, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanchen and Annick. And yeah, I was about to say if you can post the link in the chat box, but I see you have done it already.
Yeah.
So yes, any questions or compliments? I definitely really like the program because I think, especially coming from this part of the world, though my PhD is from Netherlands and I'm still continuing there, I see a drastic difference between the two countries. Being an Indian and being a student there, I see how different perspectives on parenting and how positive parenting is changing the whole scenario in both the countries. I think this program, if we can bring something like this into developing nations as well, it would be nothing less than brilliant. So
I would love
really
to. So yeah, get in touch with us in places like we're actually talking with this with a team about this, because in places such like India and other countries where early intervention is not hugely developed, then really parents have to count on themselves. And if we can reach them via Zoom and give them the feeling that they can reach, they can achieve so much, then at least it's more than a lacking system. Because yeah, we've seen very, very different early intervention systems throughout the world. In some countries it works really well, and in others there's very little. So then the parents are left to themselves.
Absolutely true. And I do believe that there is still, to a great extent, a deficit system being followed, because we are still at a place where we are identifying things as disability first. Yes, this is a disability, but how the clinicians and the parents interact, I think that is still a deficit model as compared to an empowering model. And I think something like this is really revolutionary. Thank you both of you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your time. Yeah, indeed, thank you. And actually I see the beautiful link between our presentation and Job and Judy's, yours. You see, we prove that camera works, right? Online parenting.
Yeah, great.
True, wonderful. Yes, if anybody has questions for our presenters.
If I may, I was wondering, what we found with parenting interventions in the Netherlands, but in different ethnic groups, is that this was specific, if I remember correctly, with the Turkish-Dutch families, that they would, even more than Dutch parents, want you to tell them what to do. Like, you're the expert, that was on one of your slides, right? And we saw that was a real big difference between the native Dutch community versus the Turkish-Dutch community, who were way more, I think, expecting an authoritarian, or authoritative at least, stance of an expert. And they got quite frustrated sometimes when we didn't. And they would look at you, sort of start frowning, like, well, what are you asking me questions for? So it didn't always quite gel with their expectations or even needs when we tried to do it the positive psychology way, if you will. I wonder if that's something that you found in different groups.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you asked this question, because that was actually one of the reasons why we switched to having peer facilitators, parents themselves, the parents who were trained in one group. Firstly, some of them were like so excited. I don't want to say it in a presentation, but I will say it like this. People say, "You changed my life." And people tell us all the time. I know it's really hard to put this in statistics, but they say that, and that released an incredible amount of positive energy. And many of them come forward, as in the theory of change that Yanchen, the middle group, and say, "Please, I want to do this for other parents. teach me. So when we train them and in, standing in front of the group of parents are parents like themselves, like did the group they did the first course last year, 6 months ago, a year, and then that is actually the very big difference between, if you remember, I said that we started off, I'm a clinical psychologist and a mother. And so I thought, okay, we're going to do a program with, the therapist with a family. But the barrier, and of course, therapists have the knowledge that they develop, but the barrier there is that, there are some barriers that you can't cross, whereas a parent can tell another parent, you can do it, you can do this, and you will, and it's so important. And the same parents that you're talking about, would be sitting in a group and they would see everyone else. It's what we call, we talk about peer support. They would see everyone else say, oh, I can do this, I can do that. And so that we never have in the group people say, oh, well, I'm just going to leave it to the experts. That just doesn't happen because everywhere else say, at least they do a little thing. And that's the other thing I was talking about before. That's why we really insist that the very first goals are really achievable. And we even tell them, we want to cheat. We want you to succeed in your goals. So once they succeed in the first few goals, it gives them a huge amount of confidence that they can do it too. So I hope I answered this question, but there's a difference between, I've been on both sides. I've been as a mom and as a therapist, as a clinical psychologist, and I can say that there is the barrier that we cross with the parents themselves.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking this question. I love it.
And thank you, Judi. If I may chime in just as a stats nerd here, and we want to talk with data. As you can see, that's why we put in the two moderator. One is the language, the other is the accumulated or sum of facilitators' experience or their expertise. As you can see, for all three key outcomes, experience of facilitator is minimal. It's basically the minimal size of effect and certainly not significant. So basically it means that this program, as we run across all the ethnic groups across the globe, the experience does not have a direct or effect on the total effectiveness of this program. However, that's not to precluding the potential. If we do a subgroup or subpopulation analysis, there might be certain barrier. And for me, I'm from China, so the Confucius culture, that is indeed tell us what we should do. And if you leave us alone astray, we feel like, oh, what do we do? And so, but the other thing I picked up as one person who from the similar cultural background is that it's how we define empowerment. Our empowerment is not like laissez-faire and good luck, do it. It's we train the trainers and we provide consistent support, technical and fidelity support for those facilitators, even if they got trained and they go to the field. So that multiple quality assurance mechanism will help. And the other thing is, as you can see, for the language is very significant moderator, which it means that if we are holding a ethnically and linguistically homogeneous group, then it functions better. So probably within themselves, with someone who are from, for example, Turkish or Chinese culture themselves as a facilitator, it will work better for this group.
Thank you, Yanchen, for reminding me this, because we purposefully, we purposely seek out facilitators of all languages, and this is people tell us, oh wow, if my facilitator, I was in a group and I felt, oh, if my facilitator did it as a parent, so can I. So it was a very big, even, and there's other places where, people go through cultural awareness training, and bringing someone from a completely different culture. Whereas here, if you have, the facilitators go deep in their community and they can reach and they talk the same, not just the same language, but they understand so much in depth. It makes so much sense. So yeah, as Yanchen pointed out, the experience of the facilitator is playing a small role. And actually, this is the one time when we're so happy that there was no significance. Just bringing it back to the conference that this is, psychological science, because it's not only about significant differences and coefficients. It's also about, what each variable represents.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Talk's the talk, walk's the walk. Yeah, that's why.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more time? Or sorry, is the session for another 15 minutes? Or
yes, it is. It is still. So if you have something else,
good.
Yes.
I also have to get going soon. Also, it's dinner time in Holland, so my dinner's also almost ready.
Yeah.
But,
yes.
Thank you very much. Very, very exciting to see these multi-lab collaborations, big international efforts. So it's very, very nice to see. Thanks.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you. It
Good
was
one.
wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
presentation. Take care, please.
Yeah.
Yes, you too, please.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you so much, Neha. Yeah.
Thank you, Yanchen. It was a wonderful presentation. All the
Thank
best.
you. Yeah,
Yes.
and if you want to collaborate on